Okay, hi everyone. Thank you for being here. We're going to go ahead and get started. We're going to be talking about voting and why survivors' votes matter. So to introduce myself, my name's Alex Aiello. I use she, her pronouns. I'm born and raised in New York City, and I go to Davidson College, which is in North Carolina, class of 2021, so I'll be graduating in May. I'm a sociology and gender and sexuality studies double major. And on campus, I'm also president of Students Against Sexual Violence, which is the anti-sexual violence organization. And this summer, I've been interning at the Rape, Abuse, Incest National Network, which is also known as RAIN, and I've been in the research department.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. My name is Valeria Donoso, and my pronouns are she, her, hers. I was born and raised in Miami, Florida. I also go to Davidson College. I'm a junior, though, so have 2 more years to go. And at Davidson College, I'm a Posse and Bonner Scholar, and so that means I do so much community service. I'm a biology major on the pre-med track, and for extracurriculars, I'm vice president of Students Against Sexual Violence, so I work a lot with Alex throughout the year, and I'm an hermana of Latinas Promoviendo Comunidad Lambda Pi Chi Sorority Incorporated, and in the future, I want to be a physician. I don't know what I'm interested in, but I want to be maybe a pediatrician, go into OB, I'm not sure yet. I also want to be a researcher, go into something with biology, and I also want to have a huge influence on policy advocacy. So that's one of the big reasons as to why I'm here talking with you guys, because I think it's so important that we elect officials that humanize our policies, and I think it's extremely important as survivors to recognize that. You're muted.
Sorry. So we're going to start with a land acknowledgement. We want to begin by acknowledging the indigenous peoples of the lands that we're all on today. Although we're meeting virtually, we want to acknowledge the importance of the land which we all call home. We do this to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility to improving relationships between nations and improving our own understanding of local indigenous peoples and their cultures. From coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of all First Nations people that call this nation home. Please join me in a moment of reflection to acknowledge the harms of the past and consider how we are and can, each in our own way, move forward in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration.
Okay, so today we're going to talk about why voting matters, but also just to give a rundown of what the agenda will be today. We're going to talk about the power of survivors and the impact that we have on voting, go over the government systems, just to make sure everyone's in the same playing field on what we know about, and go over the presidential elections and everything that's coming up, local elections and lobbying, so another way that you can be involved with policy rather than voting. We're going to have a breakout room little session. Also, we'll talk more about that later. Final reflections, and then Q&A. So I see already the chats, there's a couple questions in the chat, but we are going to keep questions for the end, just so we can stay focused on what we're talking about, but continue sending questions. It's totally cool. Also, we wanted to acknowledge that NRAPE on campus is a nonprofit organization, so we're not they're not necessarily advertising or sponsoring any political party or any any politician. So yeah, and also Alex and I are both college students, so we're always we want to learn, we want to continue to learn. So if we ever say something wrong, feel free to call us in so we can learn more.
Okay, so before we get into the main content, we're going to do a grounding activity, because discussing survivorship and issues related to sexual violence can be really emotionally taxing. So we're going to create space to ground ourselves in the present moment and get rid of any anxieties going into this conversation. So to begin this exercise, I invite everyone to get in a comfortable position and close your eyes. Feel your body on the seat below you. Take a deep breath in and out. Now, with your eyes closed, imagine a place that brings you feelings of peace, joy, and safety. Imagine you are in this place right now. What does it look like? Is it light or dark? Are there sounds? Is it warm or cold? What does the air feel like on your skin? Are there smells or tastes associated with this place? Fully experience any sensations of this place. Take a couple more deep breaths. Okay, when you're ready, I invite you to open your eyes and come back to the present moment. As we move forward talking about issues of sexual violence, hold on to your safe place and go back to it whenever you may feel overwhelmed. We acknowledge that this can be triggering, so if you need to leave the video or turn your video off for a little bit, that's totally fine, and we won't be offended. All right, so we know that sexual violence happens in every corner of society. Every 73 seconds, another American is sexually assaulted. We all know someone who has experienced sexual violence, and many of us have experienced it ourselves. As painful as it is to recognize the vast scope of the problem, there's also hope in knowing that we are not alone as survivors. Survivors make up a huge portion of the population, and when we come together, we are a force to be reckoned with. Tarana Burke, the founder of the Me Too movement, recently said that we as survivors make up our own constituency, which we'll see in a video next. As a constituency, we have the collective power to influence who is in office and what policies they put into place. We can push leaders to center an agenda with sexual violence at its core. And when we go to the voting booth, we can remember that we are not alone. So many survivors are voting with us, and together our votes can change this country. However, we can't have a conversation about voting without first talking about that many people do not have the ability to vote due to the huge problem of voter suppression in this country. For those of us who can vote, we can use this privilege for good and center the voices of those who don't have the same privilege. We also must recognize that voting is not the only way to engage politically, which we'll talk more about when we talk about lobbying.
Okay, so I have to connect to computer sound.
When you have 12 million people respond to a hashtag in 24 hours, we have a public health crisis.
If you want to lead in this country, then you have to actually solve for this problem. We want our leaders to treat sexual violence as a national priority.
When people said Me Too, they were counting on people to hear them and to be with them and to drive together for change.
Candidates and elected officials overall have been pretty silent on what they're going to do to advance the rights and interests of survivors.
We're not asking politicians to check off a box and say, oh, we did Me Too, we got that covered. The constituents that you are responsible for in this country, millions of them raise their hand to say Me Too, and you have not responded to them yet. Me Too voter is to underscore the fact that I am not just a survivor. I'm a Black woman, I'm a mother, I'm an activist, I'm an advocate, and I'm a survivor. And I need you to respond to all of those things, not just any one of them.
We know that survivors collectively are a force, and they're a force as voters.
politicians are not putting forth policy proposals related to this problem and treating it as the epidemic that it is.
It's shocking to me that the story of sexual violence and solutions to address sexual violence and support survivors have not been at the forefront of the elections conversation. We need to change that.
It's time for policymakers to truly listen to survivors as voters, to listen to survivors as constituents, as workers.
Currently, our civil rights law that prohibits discrimination actually doesn't cover all workers in all workplaces.
There are millions of workers who fall through the cracks. At the federal level, in order to be protected by our Title VII sexual harassment and discrimination protections, you have to have at least 15 employees in your workplace. That effectively excludes the entire care industry. In the domestic work setting, the vast majority of workplaces are just one person.
There are policies around statute of limitations that say that a person who has survived sexual violence only has this amount of time to seek any kind of recourse. We don't have comprehensive sex education in our schools as a federal law across the country.
When you have a situation in which there are workers who actually have no protection under our federal law for sexual violence against them, that makes the situation even more dangerous for them.
Some of the least visible, most vulnerable workforces are places where this issue is most pervasive. So just thinking about domestic work and care work where workers are incredibly isolated, working alone, hidden behind closed doors. Oftentimes it's women of color, oftentimes it's immigrant women who are vulnerable on multiple fronts of their lives.
We need to connect the poverty wages and the poor working conditions overall with the risk factors for sexual violence and other kinds of exploitation against workers.
We've seen what's possible when policymakers actually want to take action. We've seen exciting momentum around one fair wage so that tip workers aren't having to choose between enduring harassment and getting enough pay to support their families. We've seen survivors come together and take on the Department of Education as it tries to make it easier for schools to get away with not addressing sexual violence on their campus.
Imagine if there were resources that were put into the Violence Against Women Act or create a new legislation that gave resources to colleges and organizations that deal with sexual violence beyond just your immediate crisis services. Imagine if there was legislation that talked about HR policies at a corporation that on the front end, before you hire people, required you to do an amount of work to make sure that you're not bringing people into your company that could be potentially sexual harassers, right?
These are the things that people should be talking about. It's time to hear plans.
Women, even though we're the majority of voters, in 2018 we were 54% of the electorate, we are still treated as a minority and a special interest group, and so many of the concerns and experiences and priorities of women, especially women of color, are still really sidelined.
Imagine if we voted along the lines of our survival. Not red, not blue, not green, not any other place, but along the lines of, I'm only voting for the candidate that puts my safety as a priority. I'm only voting for the candidate that takes my safety seriously. I'm only voting for the candidate that understands that healing is not linear, and I'm gonna need more time, I'm gonna need more space, I'm gonna need more resources to come back to myself as a whole person and a whole citizen. Imagine what that looks like. Survivors are absolutely a constituency, and we are a power base because there's too many of us to deny.
An issue that was taboo is no longer taboo, and now we're not asking whether change is possible, we're asking what next is going to be possible because of the collective work that we're doing.
The issue of sexual violence isn't one that began with the Harvey Weinstein stories, and it won't end with the next election. But we have a tremendous opportunity now to meet the cultural moment and drive the sort of change that is lasting. The millions of people who said Me Too, they don't just live online. They have gathered together in community. They have gone and pressed their workplaces to make meaningful change.
Survivors are change makers.
Workers,
Students,
Survivors are family,
In our military,
powerful.
resilient.
solutionaries.
survivors are voters.
Sorry. Okay, great. Love that video. So before we go on and talk about the presidential election coming up and everything else, we want to talk about the government systems, pretty much explain everything that we have the power to vote for and other things. So our government is made up of three branches. We have the legislative, executive, and judicial. So the legislative is made up of the Congress, which is then made up of the Senate and the House of Representatives. So the Senate, you have 2 per state, and the House of Representatives, the number varies per state depending on the population. So let's say your state has a larger population, then you would have more House representatives. And then if you have a smaller population, you would have less representatives, right? So those are the people that make up Congress, and they make the laws. And the executive branch is made up of the president, vice president, and cabinet. These are the people that sign off on the laws or they veto them, which I'll get into later. And so then the judicial, the third one, is people that implement the laws. So the Supreme Court, and then also state courts, county courts. So as citizens, citizens have the right to vote for the Senate and the House of Representatives, so the 2 senators and however many House of Representatives that you have. And then we also have the power to vote for the president. So we don't have the power to vote for the cabinet or the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court and the cabinet are appointed by the president. So even though we're voting just for the president, right? We're voting for so much more than that. We're voting also for the Supreme Court, for the cabinet, and we're voting for the person who's going to have the power to choose those people. Also, the Supreme Court and the cabinet, they do have to be approved by Congress, but regardless, the president is the one that appoints those and, you know, gives those people a suggestion. So that's something to keep in mind of when we do vote for president. Okay, so also, how do laws come to be? So pretty much an idea is presented to the legislators. So the senator, a senator, House representative, right? An idea is presented to them, and we'll talk more about how to present these ideas and how to lobby, which is pretty much what that means. So legislator will hear an idea, come up with like a policy, a law that they want to make, and they write it into a bill. So a bill is just a draft of a law. And then the bill would then be taken to a sort of group of individuals that will evaluate the bill and negotiate and compromise and, you know, sort of fix it up, right? And then it would go back to the floor for voting by the Senate and the House of Representatives. And then after that, let's say it does get passed, they vote that yes, you want to pass it through. It would then go to the executive branch, which is the president. So the president would either sign off yes, or they would veto the law presented. Vetoing meaning like just denying it, right? So let's say they do veto the law, right? It would go back to the floor, and let's say the floor has a huge amount of voting that will overrule that veto and the law can be implemented. So we as constituents have the power to influence and educate these people who make and write these laws. And we'll talk more about that later.
So now we'll talk about one of those areas of government, which is the president, and we'll talk about the election. But I want to start the conversation about the 2020 election by voicing how painful it is to be a survivor during this election cycle. Women have come forward with stories of sexual assault at the hands of both Donald Trump and Joe Biden. This means that we'll be choosing between 2 men who have accusations of sexual assault against them on the ballot. As a survivor, this is really triggering, and we've constantly been seeing the faces of those who have caused harm, a kind of harm that we know all too well. Feeling exhausted, traumatized, or triggered is a valid response to this election cycle, especially as we get closer to November and see more and more news about it. I invite us all not to judge ourselves and to give ourselves extra moments for self-care as we go forward and get closer to November. The election leaves survivors in a bit of a tricky spot because we might not feel comfortable lobbying for either candidate. I by no means want to advocate for us carrying signs with either of their faces on it, telling everyone what great men they are. However, I think we have the opportunity to reframe this election and move away from focusing on the individual candidates towards focusing on the policies that they will put in place. We can think about how our votes will impact future Supreme Court justices and federal policies that will last beyond 4 years and impact our lives in the future.
Okay, so yeah, so as Alex said, we do want to focus on the president and the presidential election, but we also want to recognize that we decide so much more than that when we vote for president. We decide for the Supreme Court and the cabinet. So just two people on the cabinet that I wanted to highlight because I feel like they're very important in protecting survivors. So the Secretary of Education right now is Betsy DeVos. And I'm sure like everyone has heard a lot about the changes that she's been making of funding allocation, but also the Title IX, especially recently, where she made changes within that, which would allow for campuses to not protect survivors as much as they should be. So there's a lot more leniency of what campuses can do. And so, for example, like we have the two parties, the people that committed harm and the survivors, right? So they allow for cross-examination within these two parties, which means someone on the, it could be a relative of the person who did harm, like a mother, can question the survivor, which is extremely traumatic and just totally not okay. It's just terrible. So that's allowed through Title IX. And lengthy investigations are also allowed through Title IX. Before, there was policies, the policy said that it was limited to 60 days, but now, which is still a lot, 60 days is still very long, dreadful for a survivor to have to go through and to just be dragged along this process for 60 days, right? So now it's, the campuses can drag it out for even longer. The limit, there is no time limit. So investigations can be as long as possible. And I think, survivors are also going to be, they're not going to want to go through these investigations as much and go through this process because of how long it's going to take. And, it just doesn't seem as feasible, So also campuses have the power to deny having to do investigations for cases that they don't see as like severe, which is crazy that campuses now have the power to say, no, your harm is not valid. Your experiences are not as bad as this case. So I think that's just a lot for survivors to have to go through. And pretty much just the obligation that campuses have now to react to sexual misconduct is reduced immensely. I also wanted to highlight the Secretary of Defense. They're in charge of protecting a lot of survivors within the military. As we've seen recently with the case of Vanessa Guillen, she was recently murdered by a higher official, and she experienced sexual violence within the military from a higher official. And so the Secretary of Defense is in charge of implementing and advocating for policies that can protect survivors within the military. And just talking about Vanessa Guillen's story, there was a movement that sparked up in Twitter that's called like hashtag I am Vanessa Guillen, and it sparked so many stories of survivors within the military that spoke up about their experiences and how terrible it was to go through this process, and that they have now and how they're not protected as much in the military. So these are two important people that, you know, we have to make sure that when we decide for president, the president's also keeping in mind those survivors that will be affected by these people and the policies that they advocate for. Also, I want to mention the Supreme Court and how I know we don't vote for the Supreme Court, but we do vote for a president who will appoint those in the Supreme Court, and they have the power to limit reproductive rights, LGBTQ rights, and protect them in the workplace, and they're in charge of immigrant rights for like DACA and everything like that we've seen recently. Specifically, I wanted to mention the decision made on July 8th where SCOTUS, which is the Supreme Court, decided that the Affordable Care Act, which is ACA, that employers can, based on their religious belief, that they can decide to not cover preventative services like birth control for those that mostly women, so menstruators. And also, so now we're gonna go into local elections. So for local elections, who do we vote for, right? For local elections, it would be the governor, state legislator, mayor, commissioners, etc. So the governor and state legislator, I like to think of it like the sort of the framing that I explained before with the federal perspective. So the governor would be the executive, and then the state legislators would be the legislative branch. So the state legislators would write these policies, and the governor would implement them and sign them in. And the mayor and commissioners, more of a city base. So commissioners would distribute funding, and they would just be deciding on, you know, whether the funding is going to go towards education, towards community enrichment, public safety, things like that. That's what the commissioners are in charge for. And usually commissioners are an even number. So then the mayor would be the deciding vote. Also, so I want to just, you know, go over how important these elections are. And I feel like not many people really, you know, are aware of these elections going on, or they don't know people that are running. So you kind of just like vote for whoever, right? So I think it's very important that we become educated on who is running and what their policy, what policies they want to advocate for, right? So because they have a huge effect on our daily lives, like income taxes, funding distributions, like I mentioned before, commissioners, and reproductive rights. So specifically here in Florida, Governor Rick Scott signed in a law that would make a mandatory 24-hour wait period after you meet with your doctor in order to have an abortion. So, but this 24-hour wait period, you wouldn't have to do it unless you had documentation of some form of sexual violence, sexual assault. So, I mean, as survivors, we know that this is extremely difficult to obtain documentation or proof, a valid proof, right, to get from any sexual assault experience or sexual violence. So that itself is very difficult to obtain, and puts survivors in a very traumatic experience to have to, you know, open up about this experience and their incident. So kind of puts as survivors in that. And also the 24-hour wait period is just, you know, pretty much forcing someone to go through 24 hours and have, you know, so much anxiety during that 24 hours and through something that was a very hard decision to make in the first place. So just wanted to point out, give an example of what these local elections and how they can have an effect in our lives. And also we have so much more power locally, more than we think, I think. And so decisions are made by popular vote, not by, there's no electoral vote or anything like that. So it's not going to be in cases in the past where popular vote was way higher than electoral vote. So it's not decided through that. So we have a lot more power, and every single vote counts, like literally. In 2018, I put this example because I think it was just insane that they won over one vote. So I think that's just very, it just gives some perspective of how much our vote counts, and literally every single vote counts. Also, we have a huge influence on our local officials. They are aware that your vote is so important. So they're going to want to listen to you. They're going to want to hear what you're advocating for, why you want these policies in place. And while you're lobbying, which is, educating and expressing what you're passionate about towards these local officials, they'll be wanting to listen because, their job depends on your vote. So yeah, and you have so much power to influence these officials. I was talking to Alex before that I've ran into like my local officials in the supermarket or at the gym. So you can see them anytime, lobby while you're at the gym,
Great, thank you. So now that we've talked about voting and the power we have on the ballot, we also want to recognize that that's not the only way that we can influence elected officials. As members of their constituency, political leaders have a duty to show up for us through policy and action. And we don't need to feel bad about it because it's literally their job to listen to us and to do what we want because we're in their constituency. So to hold leaders accountable to do that, we can lobby for specific policies and legislation that are relative to our lives. So in this case, we might lobby for survivors' issues or issues related to sexual violence. For those of us who are not as familiar, lobbying is just seeking to influence a politician or government official on a specific issue. Historically, and even now, we might think of lobbyists as old white men, but actually all of us are qualified to lobby because we are the experts of our own lives. We know what we need and what we want, and we're qualified to speak on that to elected officials. So since we're talking about survivors and voting today, we could focus on lobbying for policies related to sexual violence, but ultimately you can lobby for anything that you're passionate about. A great tool to find things to lobby for is the website congress.gov. You can search by subject area. So for example, for the bills below, I just searched in sexual violence and you can see bills that are related to sexual violence. You can also look at your representatives and see what bills they are sponsoring. So you can see if you have something in common with them or if they're on your side about a certain issue. So when talking about sexual violence, some bills to look into are listed here. The first one is Hold Accountable and Lend Transparency on Campus Sexual Violence Act, which is House Bill 3381. And that is to hold campuses accountable to releasing information and numbers on sexual violence on campus. Another bill is the Survivor Outreach and Support Act, which is Senate Bill 1483. And that is to ensure that all survivors have access to a victim advocate separate from the institution, their college. And then Real Education for Healthy Youth Act is Senate Bill 1524, House Bill 2720. And that is advocating for comprehensive sex education, which we know leads to lower rates of sexual violence. So that's also a cool bill to lobby for. Okay, so there are many different kinds of ways that you can lobby. You can call your representatives, tweet your representatives, write a letter to them or email them. You can also request to meet with them. In this case, it would be a virtual meeting, but that's still possible. So as we discussed before, you have many representatives at the local level, and you can find them at this website, commoncause.org/find-your-representative. You'll just put in your zip code and it'll show you all your representatives and how to contact them. So getting into it, you can make a little pitch type of thing to lobby. You can modify it whether you're doing it in person or writing a letter, or for a tweet, it would have to be a certain number of characters, but this is really the core of what you'll do. We can separate it into 4 steps. So first, and these are taken from Our Voices 2020, which they have a great packet on lobbying, which is here, and we'll email this presentation so you could get that link. But basically, number 1, you're going to introduce yourself. a little bit about you and your connection to their district, because that's what qualifies you to lobby to them and why they need to listen. So whether you go to college in their district or you grew up there, you're a voter, whatever it may be, just explain that. Then number 2 is probably the most important part, which is tell your story. So you are going to explain why you're passionate about this issue and get your representatives to care about it. Then number 3, you need to make a clear demand. So don't leave it wishy-washy. Give them a clear action item that you're asking them to do, whether it's co-sponsoring it, advocating for it, voting for it on the floor. Make sure you're making that demand clear. And then lastly, you're going to want to tell them that you plan to stay active on this issue and provide contact information if they want to follow up. So we're going to do this in breakout groups, but I want to give a quick example. So if I were to lobby for one of my representatives, I could lobby to Alma Adams. She's in North Carolina. So I would say something like, "Hi, my name's Ariello. I'm a senior at Davidson College, which is in your district. When I was a sophomore on campus, I was raped and I needed support. I experienced a lot of institutional betrayal and I wanted to get access to services separate from my school, but I didn't know where to access these services. After months of being in pain on campus and not knowing where to turn, I found my local rape crisis center. I rented a car and was able to go there to see a victim advocate and get trauma-informed therapy. I'm asking you, Alma Adams, to support the Survivor Outreach and Support Campus Act, which will ensure that all survivors have access to a victim advocate that is separate from their institution. I want to make sure that no survivor has to experience the barriers to care that I experienced, and this bill will ensure that. I plan to stay active on this, so please feel free to contact me. My phone number is blah, blah, blah." So that's a little example for how you might do a lobbying speech. So now we're going to go into a breakout room. You each will, it should pop up on your screen in a few minutes when I do it, but I just want to explain. So in your group, you can share with people what you're passionate about lobbying about, if there's a specific issue or you know a bill that you really like, or it could just be a broad topic. And, or if you're not really sure the nitty gritty of it, you can just tell your story, why you're passionate about a specific topic, and how you might lobby for it by telling your story. You don't have to speak in the room if you don't want to, but this is a good opportunity to practice a really useful skill and get to know one another. So let me see if I can do, I'm going to create the breakout room now, so it should work. Okay, you should have been invited to join the room now. So go ahead and join your breakout rooms and we'll be back soon. Okay, everyone should be coming back. So we'll just wait for everyone to join back the big group. So now we're just going to reflect a little bit on the breakout groups. I want to invite anyone who's comfortable to either share your lobbying pitch or your story, or talk about how it felt to lobby about your issue and speak about it to other people. Just anything you want to share about your experience. You can raise your hand in Zoom, or you can just unmute yourself and share.
Okay, so I see Deshanae.
Deshanae, can you unmute yourself? Or
yeah.
Okay.
Oh, wait.
We can hear you.
Okay. The issue that my name is Deshanae Hughes. I'm a rising senior at Davidson College. And the issue that I'm lobbying about is abolishing prisons, jails, just any carceral system. And I'm mainly lobbying against this issue because my father is incarcerated on well, it doesn't really matter what the crime that he's done, but because within these systems, we're saying that we should just punish people instead of taking care of them, rehabilitating them. And I'm hoping that you, Alma Adams, would lobby for this issue on the floor in support of not only the Black community, but my father and other children like me who have incarcerated parents in jail, prisons, and such.
Thank you so much for sharing that.
No problem. Do I answer both questions?
Oh, if you want to share anything else, feel free.
Okay, well, that's it. That's it.
Okay, thank you. That's a great example of using your personal story to inspire empathy in your elected official and get them to care. So thank you, Deshanae. Does anyone else want to share their story or their pitch? I think I saw Cynthia might have raised her hand.
Hi, yes. Our group, we did get to the point of how we would lobby, but the issues that came up were sex education and education regarding consent, and then colleges having outside advocates, and then also using different terminology to eliminate the use of the word sex in describing sexual assaults or sexual violence, because the act of rape is not sexual, and to have especially for younger people, to have a better understanding of the difference between sexuality and violence.
That's a great point. Thank you for bringing that up. I think we might have time maybe for one more if anyone feels inclined. Okay, Charlotte.
Hi, I'm Charlotte. I also go to Davidson College. One thing, I haven't done a ton of research on this in terms of bills or what's going on in terms of lobbying, but in the community, the LGBTQ plus community, people face much higher rates of poverty, as well as they're put at much greater risk of sexual assault. And I think the way that society hypersexualizes LGBTQ people and kind of sexualizes and stigmatizes the relationships that go on can lead to partner violence. And I think a lot of this comes from homophobia, both internalized and outside and shame. And so I think, again, I said I haven't done a lot of research in terms of this, but doing something in terms of like access to therapy, as well as higher education in schools, just we were talking about earlier, like just general sex education, and including LGBTQ, both in terms of gender and sexuality, education in schools, I think is very important. I don't have anything specific with that, but that's something that's very important to me as a queer youth. So.
That's awesome. Thank you for sharing that.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much for everything that's shared. I loved hearing about everything you guys are passionate about. I loved it. Okay, so now that we've heard about all the government systems, have a clear, understanding of everything, how to lobby, we're now going to talk about voting and how to vote. So first things first, you have to make sure you are registered to vote. So you go to voting.org, register to vote, update all your information, make sure everything is right and clear. There is a registration deadline to vote. It varies per state, so make sure you are aware of that for your state. Also, if you want to update your party affiliation, that's also something that you would do through here. If you want to change it or declare a party, that's something that you would have to do. And there are deadlines for. So if you want to vote in, let's say in the primaries, I know there's some states, for example, Florida, you could only vote in the primaries if you are for a certain party. So if you're registered under a certain party, so let's say if you were in independent, you wouldn't be able to vote in the primaries. So it's very important that we make sure to update this information if we want to, you know, vote in those primaries, if your state has that law. Also, so election day is November 3rd, but early voting, primary voting, everything, you know, like other than election day, varies per state. So I also suggest for you to make sure you have those dates down. And also necessary identification that you would have to bring to the voting location, or let's say you're, I don't know if you're voting through mail. So that's something that you'd have to know and would vary through state. Also, just to make sure that everyone knows is that if your gender identity or gender presentation doesn't necessarily correlate to your gender marker or match your photo or your name, it's not required to by law. So make sure that, you know, that's not something, if you do come across this issue, that you're aware of that. I think that was very, like, you know, something important that we should know about. Also, how to vote also varies per state. So, which is super confusing, as it is, voting is very confusing already. So how to vote in every state, this link would take you to little videos on YouTube, and there's like a video for every single state, and you would be able to watch a short little video about how to vote in your state and how it works. I think it's very easy, quick way to learn about it, definitely very necessary. And also in this Google spreadsheet would be like dates and deadlines that are very important to know for your state. So like registration dates, primary voting, all those good things would be in there. So as Alex mentioned before, we're gonna get this PowerPoint to you, and you would have access to these links if you guys are interested.
Great. Now, if anyone has any questions, you could put them in the chat. Yeah. And also, I want to point out that Kenyora put in the chat that you can also register to vote with EROC, weall.vote/EROC.
I also received a question in the chat box asking if I knew of any resources for Spanish speakers. There are a couple resources through RAIN, and it was for in Spanish, but also for Latinx individuals. I know it's like National Latin Network. That's also provide resources for Latinx individuals. I write it down in the chat if anyone is interested. But that's also a resource if that's something.
I also got a question about would we recommend voting by mail or in person? And I would say it's really a personal preference. With everything with COVID, voting by mail might be safer, but it's really up to you. There's a lot of ways that voting is often limited, whether it be in person or by mail. So whichever you feel most comfortable with and is easiest for you.
Yeah, I think especially now with mail, with COVID, is something that people are leaning towards, right? And that's where a lot of voter suppression is coming in, because, you know, voting locations are now closing and not making it accessible for individuals to vote. And there's now rumors going around that voting is going to be manipulated if it goes through mail, and that's not true, and that's just an attempt to suppress voters and limit people from voting, and you know, so that's just something to keep in mind. And you're still able to vote through mail. I am.
Well, if there's no more questions, once again, thank you all for being here, and we'll also include our contact information in the PowerPoint when we send it to you if you think of anything else. But thank you again, and hopefully you learned something today.
Thank you guys so much.
Thank you.